Thank you for tuning into this teaching. We hope this message blesses you. Our mission as Marigold Church is to do anything and everything so that anyone and everyone can encounter the real Jesus. We hope as you listen to this, you would encounter the real Jesus. Let him transform your mind, transform your heart, and encounter you today.
Hello, everybody. We are gathered here again, and we are talking about enough is enough. We've been talking about how the gospel is enough. And as I promised last week, we are going into today's message, which is titled Terrorists and Televangelists. Now, before you get up in arms or like, oh, wow, what's this all about? It's very tongue-in-cheek. Let me explain. We're talking about how the gospel truly is enough. I'm talking about the true Christ-centered gospel, not the other isms or other gospels, prosperity gospel, social justice gospel. We're not talking about activism gospel. We're just talking the true and simple gospel of Jesus. So when we talk about that, there's a simplicity in it, and we talked in just how simple the gospel is. The Bible never says it's easy, but it is simple. And when we try to add a bunch of stuff to it, when we try to add works to it and earnings to it and like a merit system, we're not adding to the gospel, we're really taking away from the gospel. And it actually becomes a different gospel, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to cover that in just a moment. But let me kind of define some terms real quick. When I talk about terrorists, I'm talking about in a broad sense of the word terrorist. We know about terrorists. We know how terrorists will generally they can be terrorists within your own country, terrorists that go out into another country, but the whole object is to create terror, to this terrorist, and what it does is it brings in fear. And so I feel like there are terrorists within this idea of the gospel. There's obviously people groups in the world that would strap bombs to themselves and blow places up because of the hatred of another idea or another viewpoint of what it is to be holy or to be a part of God's life. And so we would call someone like that a terrorist. But a terrorist could be anyone who strikes terror. A person in the media could be strike terror and make you afraid of being able to say something and speaking out for Christ or doing like that. Anything that brings terror, anything that, or anyone or a group who comes together for the point of striking terror is a part of terror. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about terrorism. I was reminded of this idea of what a terrorist with one of those ideologies would think of what heaven is. And because we are going to be talking about heaven and hell in this segment as well. And you can take this joke however you want it. But a terrorist straps on this bomb and he's going to blow something up and he's promised these 70 virgins. And so he goes and he carries out this thing and here he is in what he thinks it's the afterlife or this thing, and he's in this room and it's full of men. And they go and he's shaking their hands and they're introducing themselves, and he's like, hey, wow, are y'all here? Is this the waiting room? Are we waiting for the virgins? And the guy says, we are the virgins. And so that what he went with, this ideology of what he thought heaven was nothing like that. It was just, and so we have these false ideologies that can lead us to do these things, and that they're not all they crack up to be. And when I say televangelists, I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I really do when I think of a televangelist, I think of someone who really is out, really just in front of the camera, much like what we're doing here, is putting out the gospel, is really trying to do stuff. But sometimes in doing that, these televangelists or anybody, because televangelists really don't have a good name because of a few people that have taken advantage of people and financially and whatnot. But when I think of a televangelist, I'm really thinking of it in probably the best terms possible. Someone who's really getting in front of the camera for the sake of truly giving out the gospel. There was a little boy and he was watching, him and his dad were watching the television, and the dad says, hey, son, settle down. We're watching this televangelist. And the little boy says, what? Dad, I thought they're called evangelists. And he says, oh no, he's a televangelist because he speaks to the TVs. And the little boy looks over to his dad and says, well, I wonder how many TVs he's saved. And so, we have this idea of what a televangelist is, a little dad joke there. But it's just really this idea of you have this extreme bad in the terrorists, and you have this extreme good in the televangelist. And the ideas that they carry, completely different. One is about tearing down the gospel and making you afraid to speak it, whereas the other, in the worst sense, would add to the gospel. And that's where we get some of the prosperity gospel. If you send me $1,000, I think God's going to do this for you. If you do this, if you send this in, or if you, and there's these promises, and most of them empty promises. But instead of just really preaching the gospel, and the gospel is this, that you and I were sinners, but Jesus paid the price for our sin, and by believing in him, we are saved. That is the gospel. It's a simple thing, but we try to add to it. We try to, in adding to it, we're really tearing it down. And it's no difference between what a terrorist would do to intentionally tear it down, and what someone would try to do, even in good intention, to add to the gospel. It really takes away from it. It actually becomes something different, as we'll see here in the Word. And we covered this a couple weeks ago in Galatians chapter 1 in verse 6. We're going to read 6 through 10. It says, this is Paul. It says, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed, as we have said before. So I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. And this is the dangerous thing, is that where we would be so engaged in the culture that our passion becomes being liked by men, being liked by people. And that's a hard thing to get around. That's not an easy thing. We want to be liked. It's something we want to be liked. If someone doesn't like you, you're wondering why doesn't so and so like me? I don't understand. And you're trying to reason with it. And what did I do? And people want to be liked. Some of the best decisions that I've ever made, and most loving decisions I've ever made, were when I made a decision and I had to set aside what people thought. Some of the worst decisions that I've ever made, either as a leader, as a pastor, as a father even, was when I was concerned and worried about what people thought. I've made some really bad decisions as a father, being concerned with what my kids thought. What if they don't like me? I'm not going to be that cool dad for a minute. That's when I've made some tough decisions, bad decisions, is when I've wanted to be liked. We need to be seeking God's favor. And when we preach the true gospel and we seek after the true gospel, we have the favor of God. And everything else will come with it. But let me tell you, there's two parts that we've got to look at. One is the gospel believed. The gospel believed. You know, that is salvation. To believe the gospel is salvation. You know, obviously, when you believe the gospel, even though you're saved, you don't see it. There's nothing that happens externally. But there's something more important that's happening inside. You see, the gospel works from the inside out. You see, that's where it's not only the gospel believed, but the gospel applied. You see, the gospel applied moves us from salvation into this place of sanctification. That's this idea of I've been saved, I'm being saved, and I'm going to be saved. I'm going to have a new body, a glorified body when Christ returns. Those are those three things, but it starts with believing the gospel, the true gospel. The gospel confronts real hurt. That's what's so great about the gospel. The true gospel doesn't try to get around the hurts that you've experienced in your life. But it doesn't stay there. You see, the gospel confronts real hurt, but it also reveals real hope. Real. I'm talking real. You know, one of the things that you'll hear us talk about is our mission at Marigold Church is to do anything and everything so that anyone and everyone can encounter the real Jesus. The real Jesus. The real Jesus is the one who presents the real gospel. The real Jesus is the real gospel. You see, that's the great thing about the gospel. The gospel is not just a list of principles. The gospel's not just a demand of certain practices. No, the gospel is a person. And this person is Jesus. He embodies what it is to be the gospel. He is the gospel. Jesus is the good news. He's that embodiment of the good news of salvation. Not salvation by works. No, just salvation by believing. By believing. You've been destined to believe. Will you believe when you're presented with the true gospel? You see, a lot of times what we try to do, and we do this, and a lot of times we do this to try to please the culture, is we try to take away certain things from the gospel. Either we'll add things or we'll take away things. Some of the things that we try to take away from the gospel is the blood. We don't like to talk about blood. That's spooky. That's crazy. Who wants to talk about blood? Who wants to get dressed in their Sunday best to go to church and hear about blood? But it's that blood that saved us. It's the shedding of that blood that made our purity possible. Without the blood, there is no gospel. There is no good news. You see, there's life in the blood. And Jesus laid down his life. That is the gospel. So to take away the blood is to take away the gospel. To take away Jesus is to take away the gospel. I know that sounds crazy, but some people want the gospel, they just don't want Jesus. They want the good news, they just don't want the good news giver. They would rather embrace the messenger, but not necessarily the message of the gospel. And that's a dangerous place. On the other hand, we're trying to add works. If you'll just be good enough. But if you're good enough, why would you need the gospel? The fact of the matter is, we can't be good. There is no good. Sometimes I think we fool ourselves into not realizing just how rotten we are. And we try to do good things and with good intentions. But it's nothing without the gospel. You see, everything around us is temporary. The gospel is something that's eternal. You know, my friends, heaven and hell is eternal. And one of those things that I think the terrorists and the televangelists get wrong is this idea of heaven and hell. I know it's a kind of a crude joke in the beginning about the terrorists and what he thought was heaven. But there's this perverted sense of what heaven is, this sensually or the sensuality based place where all my lusts are fulfilled. That's not heaven. There's a lot of people here on earth that we would look at them and we think, man, they have heaven on earth. They have everything you could imagine, every material thing, every physical thing. And yet there's hell inside of them. They're tormented. And hell is not this place just of, we don't think it's just this pitchfork devil and poking you and fire all around and we have some religion will teach it's that way and then others it's one big party. Every sin that you could commit, you're down there and you're committing it. My friend, that's not heaven and hell. See, you can have a glimpse of heaven here on earth. And it has nothing to do with what's around you as much as it is what's inside of you. Who's inside of you? I give this example. No one would ever want to be at war or in the middle of a battle. But I've heard stories of courageous men who are in the midst of battle. And they're on the front lines, and there they are. They have their brothers in arms around them, and they're together. And there's no place in the world they would rather be in that moment, because there's this unity and connection with. They don't want to be there. Yeah, they'd rather be at a beach or something, but the problem is there's someone on the beach who's sitting there and thinking of committing suicide or ending their life or in regret, and there's someone that's in the sands of a battlefield who is just happy and excited to be there, not because of what is going on, but because they're united with their brothers. And there's this unspeakable bond between them, and there's no place I'd rather be, just at the edge of your seat in a football game, and you got the butterflies. Is your team gonna win? It's the final seconds. It could go any way. And there's this excitement, and I'm on the verge of it, just jumping out of my seat over excitement, or hanging my head in my hands in complete disappointment. And there's no place I'd rather be than right in that moment. That's a glimpse of heaven. And there's this other part of hell where you have everything you want, everything around you. But there's an emptiness inside. There's a loneliness inside. Imagine a place where you're connected with God without any risk of interruption. You're in unity with the Father, the Son, and His Spirit. And it's eternal. And it's pure. It has no ending. That's heaven. Imagine a place where you're completely disconnected. And it's hollow. And it's shameful and it's disappointing. And there's no hope of ever being united with anyone, especially not the Father, the Son, or His Spirit. That is hell. So when we talk about sin, When we talk about repenting and turning around and turning your life over, that's what's at stake. That's heaven and hell. That's unity versus hopelessness. We don't need to fluff the gospel or to make it something that it's not. The gospel is enough. It's that promise of hope, and it's a promise from a promise keeper in Jesus. Will you pray with me? Lord, I thank you. I thank you for your gospel. I thank you for what you did on the cross. I thank you for paying the price of separation from the Father so that I could be joined back to the Father. Not that I had to do anything. You paid it all. There's nothing I could add to what you've done, Father. I only believe. And in believing you, I receive you. Thank you for making the gospel simple. Help me to live it out. Help me to live a life worthy of that call, that invitation. I thank you for using me. Amen.
Hey, if this message or any of the content that we've been putting out has blessed you and you're wondering how you can partner with us in generosity, there are a couple ways to do that. You can download the PushPay app and you can search Marigold Church and you can give that way. You could also set up recurring giving, and it's really user-friendly. It makes it really easy to give. You could also text Marigold to 77977 and give that way. We believe God moves through a generous heart, and so we would love to see what God does through you as you partner with us and as we walk through this journey together.